Okay, good morning everyone, and can I welcome everyone to the 23rd meeting of 2019 of the Social Security Committee. Can I remind everyone present to turn off mobile phones or other devices to silent mode if they can, so they don't disrupt our meeting. Whilst we've had no apologies this morning, one of our members, Michelle Ballantyne, has been delayed due to a constituency matter, so hopefully she'll be able to join us later. And we now move to agenda item 1, which is decision on taking business in private. The committee is asked to agree that agenda item 3, consideration of evidence and pre-budget report, is taken in private. Are members agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you. We now move to agenda item 2, the performance of the Scottish Social Security System. And the committee will take evidence on the Scottish Government's recent published progress report on Social Security and Social Security Scotland's annual account. So can I therefore welcome Shirley-Anne Somerville, Cabinet Secretary for Social Security and Older People, David Wallace, Chief Executive, Social Security Scotland, James Wallace, Deputy Director, Finance and Corporate Services, Social Security Scotland, and Fiona Campbell, Acting Head of Legislation and Operational Policy Unit, Social Security Directorate, Scottish Government. Can I thank all 4 of you for being with us here this morning, and can I invite the Cabinet Secretary to make an opening statement before we move to questions?
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. It's a pleasure to be before the committee again, this time to talk about the performance of the Scottish Social Security System. I intend to keep my opening remarks pretty brief, so to allow time for as much questions and discussions on this topic as possible. But I do feel it would be useful if I gave a brief overview of the 2 documents laid before Parliament on the 26th September this year, the Scottish Government Progress Report 2018-2019 and the Social Security Scotland Annual Reports and Accounts. Section 20 of the Social Security Scotland Act 2018 states that, as soon as practicable after the end of each financial year, Scottish ministers must lay a report before Parliament on the performance of the Scottish system during that year, as well as making said report available to the public. The Act goes on to set out that the report must contain information about the performance of the system in that year it covers, what ministers have done to meet the expectations of the Social Security Charter, a description of the data for the purpose of monitoring equality of opportunity used in preparing the report, and finally an assessment of how the Scottish system has affected the circumstances of persons living in a household whose income is adversely affected or whose expenditure is increased because a member of the household has one or more protected characteristics within the meaning of the Section 4 of the Equality Act 2010. This could be an individual's age, for example, or a disability. The Act also states that the first report made under Section 20 must include a plan setting out the Minister's intentions to collect and publish data for the purpose of monitoring equality of opportunity where existing data sources are not sufficient for the preparation of the report. For the first year of producing such a report, we have compiled 2 documents that meet these statutory requirements, and both should be read together in order to provide the fullest picture of our view of the Scottish Social Security System's performance up to the 31st of March 2019. The first document under the Scottish Government branding covers the period since Royal Assent of the Social Security Act 1st June 2018 to the end of the 2019 financial year on the 31st of March. This progress report sets out information on the performance of the social security system up to that point, which is defined as the system for giving assistance to individuals in accordance with Part 2 of the Social Security Act, including the Scottish benefits and regulations made under Part 3. The progress report also contains an update on delivery of duties in Part 1 of the Act, such as advocacy and the establishment of the Scottish Commission on Social Security. This report is not required by the Act, but it is being provided in the report in order to give a more complete picture of progress in developing the new social security powers. This detail may not be required in the longer term, however, and we will take a view at the appropriate time as to whether or not it will be included in future such annual reports. The second performance document was produced by Social Security Scotland, the executive agency created by ministers to deliver the Scottish social security system. I welcome the first annual report and accounts for the agency covering the period since the agency went live on the 1st of September 2018 to the end of the financial year on the 31st of March 2019. Social Security Scotland's annual report and accounts record the early successes of the agency, including the launch of the Best Start pregnancy and baby payment, where we saw significantly higher take-up than we expected, momentous success, as well as the launching of the Carers Allowance Supplement, providing eligible carers with an extra £442, recognising the valuable contribution they make to society. The agency also managed carers' allowance through an agency agreement with the Department of Work and Pensions. I am pleased that the Auditor has recorded a true and fair view on the accounts. I recognise that the Auditor has not been able to access all the information they would have liked on carers' allowance administered by the Department of Work and Pensions, and this has resulted in the technical modification of the Auditor's report in respect of regularity solely on carers' allowance. It is important to note that nothing has changed for carers' allowance. The Department of Work and Pensions has had a regularity qualification since 1988-1989 financial year. David Wallace is here today and he will also be happy to answer any questions on the Social Security Scotland annual reports and accounts in his statutory role as Accountable Officer under the Public Finance and Accountability Scotland Act 2000. As I've already stated, the report only covers periods up to the 31st of March this year, and we have made much progress since then on the delivery of social security in Scotland. So rather than preempt any further information the committee might like from myself or my colleagues today, I'm happy at this point to open up to any questions you may have.
Thanks very much for that, Cabinet Secretary, and we'll move to questions now. Opening question from Alistair Allen, MSP.
Thanks very much, Convener. One of the things I'm keen to hear a wee bit more about is the relationship that the Scottish Government has with the DWP in terms of provision of the information that you need and the information on which your work is reliant. Can you say any more about how that relationship is developing?
I'll certainly let David talk from an agency perspective about how the agency feels about this, but as an overall process, committee will be well aware I have regular political disagreements with the DWP and the UK Government on a number of issues when it comes to the reserve benefit system in particular. However, when we're looking at the joint programme of the devolution of benefits to Scotland, I would say that on the whole the relationship is good, that we have good working relationships both at senior official level and on a day-to-day basis through both policy and through programme. So we will have our political differences, but the governments are working well at this point together to deliver on devolution, and we will need to ensure that this joint project is delivered on time. But I'll let David talk from an agency perspective perhaps about how he feels on that.
Sorry, I should apologise first. I'm suffering a slight chest infection, so apologies if I stumble through this. So I think from an agency perspective, there's a couple of things about the relationship. In terms of the relationship of getting the data we need for our day-to-day benefits, by the time that comes into the agency, those systems have been developed through our programme and our policy colleagues, and on the whole, that works on a sort of system basis. So the day-to-day relationship we have with DWP isn't about trying to draw data from them on a daily basis. There's a couple of other areas that we have sort of ongoing relationships with DWP. One is the more strategic, and we might come on to it in terms of the carers allowance element of it. And the more developing one is probably in preparation for when we have more of the Wave 2 benefits and when we have local delivery in place. We're well aware that we'll effectively share clients in Scotland, so how we make sure that that service feels joined up once we start to get into that element of it. But again, I would just echo what the Cabinet Secretary said about the overall relationship at official level between DWP, and as I think I've said here before, it's a good working relationship where we do. What makes it kind of distinctive in some ways is sometimes the scale of DWP. So how you get to the right person to talk to you about some of these things can be an initial challenge. But once we're in there, we have a strong working relationship.
A question perhaps for either of you, but part of that relationship that you've just described, Mr. Wallace, is the agency agreements or management agreements that exist. How much more work has to be done on those? Are those functioning well?
I think they're functioning well, so I will no doubt come on to it in terms of the qualification of the accounts, but in terms of the information that we need to get in order from carers allowance to pay carers allowance supplement, for example, that's now well embedded and working well. The agency agreements themselves are fundamentally based on the nothing changes, so in that sense they don't need daily sort of activity to make sure they're functioning. You know, their core basis of DWP will continue to do exactly what they do for that set of clients. So there is very much a nothing changes basis of the agency agreements.
And part of the question around this, I suppose, as well as what you might call the legislative environment that exists at Westminster just now, if I can put it as politely as that, a more political question here, but I wonder if that legislative environment, indeed that lack of legislation, I believe that the only two bills the UK Parliament has managed to pass in the last year have been one about a general election and one about the rights of circus animals in England and Wales. Does that lack of the ability to legislate, that lack of a period when legislation and secondary legislation seems to be possible, does that have any impact on the relationship, or are you managing your way through that?
It could have a very significant impact on the delivery of future benefits if the orders that we require to go through Westminster don't go through Westminster, the most obvious one being on the Job Start payment, which we would like to launch in the spring, but that I require there to be movement within a UK government, UK Parliament sense on that. My officials are working very, very closely with both the Secretary of State for Scotland's office and the DWP. They are well aware of our timetables and our requirements to get that through at certain points to allow us to do certain things. Another one, for example, is our ability to give the draft regulations on disability assistance for children and young people requires, again, a further process at a UK level to allow that to happen. So the UK government is well aware of that, they're aware of the timetables, they're aware of the implications for that, and we continue to work with them to ensure that that happens. Now, that's not in my gift, it's not in anyone's gift within the Scottish Government to do. I'm very well aware that it is a process down there that needs to happen. If it comes to the point where that is having or will have an impact on how we are delivering, I will of course report back to the committee. It's not at this point, but it's certainly something that we're very alive to. It goes back to that point. It's a joint project, and the UK government needs to do what they need to do as well as what the Scottish government needs to do, and we both need to stick to our required timetables.
Thank you, Convener.
Okay, Keith Brown, yes.
Thanks, Convener. Just a quick supplementary on that. And first of all, I would pay tribute to the foresight of Westminster for legislating on circuses before the general election. I think that's probably a good thing to do. In relation to the agency agreements and the carers allowance, though, you mentioned, Cabinet Secretary, in your opening statement about how that was the one area where there was not a qualification but a modification of something in the accounts, and that had been true for a number of years. I just wondered, it seems odd to me on the face of it that the Scottish Government would agree to an agreement which does not provide management information at a Scottish level. It just seems it would be a very important thing to have to understand how things are working and why it would be the case. Is it because there are other things which make up for that? I just wondered why that was the case.
Yeah, certainly I'll let colleagues from the agency talk about the management information that they do have that allows them to progress with the work that they are required to do. The simple reason for the agency agreement is that it allowed us to move forward very quickly with the establishment of the carers allowance supplement, because with the DWP moving with the carers allowance through the agency agreement, it allowed the Scottish Government to be able to focus on early delivery of a pledge to ensure that we were getting money into the pockets of carers. Had we not had an agency agreement, we would be at the point where we would have to take on the system on board ourselves, introduce carers allowance up here. That obviously takes time to be able to do that, to get that right, to be able to consult with people, ensure that that's designed in a way that works for carers. And we would not have been able to deliver the carers allowance supplement and that direct payment to carers as quickly as we did. I mean, that was done within the first week of the agency moving forward, was how quickly that the carers allowance supplement progressed. So that's the reason why we moved forward with the agency agreement. But in terms of the management information that the agency does give, I'll perhaps hand over to David at that point.
So just to echo that point, agency agreements as they come into the agency, the fundamental is that they stay the same. So if DWP do not have that management information. The agency agreement isn't a vehicle to create a new set of management information necessarily from DWP. That would be a further discussion about the effort required to do that, whether their systems actually enable them to do that, whether they can identify the correct people within there. So as you try to bespoke any of these agency agreements, you move further away from the as-is, in which case you add time and cost to that. And as Cabinet Secretary says, there was a decision made around about the importance of getting this paid rather than doing that. We do, in saying all of that, we don't simply just blindly sort of sign off the agency agreements in that sense. James can say a little bit more around about how we sort of put some structure around about those agency agreements, and we do get limited management information in from DWP on that. But it is, as Cabinet Secretary said, on the basis of if the DWP don't have it, they can't supply it. So it's not that they have something that they're refusing to give us, it's simply that that information is not collated in a way that kind of sits that Scottish population. But I don't know if James, you want to just a little
I'll add slightly to it. I think it's important that I draw out for the committee that we do get the management information that we need to enable us to prepare accounts. So the auditor signed off our accounts as true and fair because we've been given the Scottish specific information on expenditure and receipts. When we create agency agreements, we look at the value and paying DWP essentially to create bespoke management information for us and going through all the processes that would require to get that new subset of data at a DWP level just for Scotland. And when we look at things like overpayments, the types of things we consider are whether we need specific information for Scotland, whether it is likely that Scotland would be considerably different from a UK level. What would cause us to require an independent data set? If it is DWP that are administering carers allowance on our behalf using the systems and processes they've always used, why would the performance information look any different from Scotland than it does for the entire United Kingdom? And those are the types of things that we consider on a sort of risk-based approach as we go through and set up the agency agreements. But certainly if we were identifying needs for Scottish specific data sets, I think that is something we'd likely to talk to DWP about.
Well, just to say that I'm sure that's true. Just from a layperson's point of view, it seems odd that perhaps the most fundamental thing you'd want to have would be performance specifically for customers resident in Scotland. I understand it maybe satisfies the accounting requirements, but I would have thought it would have been really important to have that information for customers in Scotland. And I suppose the last little point is to say whether, given all that you've said, is this a kind of suboptimal kind of interim phase because you've done this very quickly, as the Cabinet Secretary says, that you'll hope to rectify in due course? It just strikes me that if you don't know what the performance criteria is, you won't be able to ask those questions, and just simply assuming it's as it is the case in the rest of the UK. I just thought it would be built in from the very start, you'll be able to do that from Scotland. Is that something you're looking to rectify in future, or are you happy with the way things are?
Well, any changes we would ask to make would come with a cost, and they would come with they would have to come with the agreement of DWP to make any changes to the agency agreements. They're under no obligation to do so. The absolute requirement, not just for agency agreements as they're used in social security, but as they have been used in the whole 20 years of devolution, is that it's business as usual that we run that. I think the question that we will always ask is, do we have the information that we require to satisfy ourselves that the benefits are being paid and are working correctly? And I'm content, I think the agency is content, that we get that information and we have that information. The obvious change would be as if we were working from different rules and eligibility up here, then obviously there would be a requirement, a greater requirement for us to see a different level of information. But as I said, because we took the decision to put the carers allowance in, the carers allowance supplement in right at the start, and therefore the rest of the rules and regulations about carers allowance stay the same, then that suggests to me that if we're getting everything that we require to be able to run this effectively, then the changes would come when we make changes to the carers allowance itself, and we have the full devolution of that. To spend time asking for data that we don't feel, the agency doesn't feel is required, would I think, just be something else for us to do rather than focusing on what we're doing at the moment, which is the delivery of Wave 2. So I'm content we're getting everything that we require as a government. Agencies content that they're getting everything they require from their perspective for the running of this, and therefore I would prioritise other issues over something which I don't feel we require at this point.
It might also just be very, for carers allowance specifically, it might just be in terms of what you would do with that Scottish specific information if you had it. A carers allowance isn't a benefit that's administered in Scotland locally by DWP. It is administered by the single team. So the same process, the same applications flow through the same team wherever in the UK those applications come from. So the assumption that the UK data reflects the Scottish data isn't a huge extrapolation. It's very much focused on this is where that benefit is administered. It's not a locally administered benefit.
Can I explore the operational capacity at Social Security Scotland? I suppose one of the first tests that the agency had was around payment of the Best Start grant. Now, there was a stress on the system, I think it's fair to say, in relation to that. The kind of stress that I like, because it was far more oversubscribed than was anticipated. So if we must have stress on the system, that's not a bad place to be. But the reality is there had to be a manual workaround in relation to dealing with some of those stresses. So I suppose what I would like to ask is, as we go forward with the Best Start grant, have those manual workarounds now been automated? They're now kind of mainstreamed into the IT systems and the processes within Social Security Scotland?
Well, I'll begin by, again, paying tribute to all the agency staff who are involved in the introduction of the Best Start grant on the 10th of December, and that's right from David down. They did remarkably well with the level of demand that came in, which, as you say, convener, is a very good thing. Workarounds are something which are discussed as the programme develops, so well before a go-live date, there will be an acceptance that there will be some manual workarounds that are required during that process once go-live happens. So they're not necessarily a bad thing in themselves. They are built into the programme, known by the agency, and the staff are therefore well trained in those. There's a period, obviously, of continuous improvement that goes on after a benefit goes live. That is to do with some of the manual workarounds. It's to do with other aspects as well, as we continue to improve once we've seen everything in a go-live state. So I'll again let colleagues from the agency talk a little bit more about some of the manual workarounds that are in place. The fact that Audit Scotland has no issue with the manual workarounds. They think they work successfully and well, but also the work that it's ongoing. And I think it is very important to stress again how the agency has a very close working relationship with the programme, so that as we're moving forward with continuous improvement and improvement updates to the programme, then the agency's requirements are absolutely taken on board when we're working out what can be done in the future iterations of what comes forward. And those are, very regularly done on a programme basis, that we see that continuous improvement. So this is a programme that will inevitably have iterations as we go through it. That's a part of the normal process. That won't change. That will always be the case after a go live. But the important aspect for me is that the manual workarounds, if they're there, are working well, that the staff are well trained in using them, that Audit Scotland agree with that assessment, and that the working relationship between agency and programme ensures that if there is something which the agency determines needs to change and requires to change, for example, before another benefit comes on stream, then that is obviously built in. The most obvious example to that is, of course, as we build up to the Scottish Child Payment, then a manual workaround that we might use for some of the smaller benefits that are a one-off payment might be perfectly acceptable, but wouldn't be acceptable in an operational state when we're talking about the scale of what would happen under a Scottish Child Payment. But I'll let David add to that as well.
Yes, I think just to add to what the Cabinet Secretary was saying there, I think I would separate the two things out slightly in terms of the day one of Best Start grant and manual workarounds. So, yeah, we were pleasantly surprised by the uptake of Best Start grant on particularly that first day and that first week, and the way that the agency coped with that heightened sort of demand wasn't the manual workarounds, that was the sort of contingency that we deployed. So we had people moving across from other activities to focus on Best Start grant. The agency worked additional hours, it kept itself open longer, it worked weekends. It had an interesting Christmas over that last Christmas to kind of cope with that. And as Cabinet Secretary said, performed, I think, extraordinarily well to deal with that demand. As Cabinet Secretary was saying there, the manual workarounds are something slightly different, so they weren't deployed as a result of demand. They were already a known thing that we would do, and even the language of workaround is probably slightly misleading. They're manual processes, and as we work...
A contingency. So the Social Security Scotland estimate what the uptake would be, planned an automated version of that, anticipated what they would do if it was higher, and there was a contingency in place. Was this all pre-planned before you saw what the uptake was for Best Start grant?
I would say contingency with a small c. We knew how to deal with fluctuations in demand, so it was about how we used the agency resources to focus on that demand. But we always knew exactly what the system would deliver on day one. And that close working with the programme, we use a terminology in terms of what we're delivering of the infrastructure. And I think you've had programme colleagues talking about the agile development of that. It has functionality that allows us to deliver the benefits we need to deliver. There are additional functionality that, of course, we would like to see in it, but for the scale of the benefits we're currently doing, the manual workarounds are absolutely sufficient to deliver the volumes that we've got, if that makes sense.
When have the manual workarounds finished, or when will they be complete and it will be into a fully kind of automated or fully IT compliant system rather than a manual contingency, if that's a better word for it?
Again, I would hesitate about the word compliant. We have a compliant system, so it is manual processes over and above what the system does for us. If I can pick one example then to try and make it more real. As we prepare appeals, for example, there's a duty on the agency to prepare that material to go to the tribunal for appeal. That is a process that at the moment is quite highly manual for the agency, and for the volumes that we've currently got, that's fine. That manual workaround, if you like, is an absolutely fine, compliant system that we've got. As the Cabinet Secretary says, particularly as we move into Scottish Child Payment, that will not be appropriate for the volume of Scottish Child Payment. So we're working with our programme colleagues to make sure that that can be automated ahead of Scottish Child Payment. So there are still manual processes in the organisation, and to a degree always will be, but I wouldn't think of those as suboptimal. And actually, as Audit Scotland point out in some of this, even though there's manual processes involved, there hasn't been a fault, as it were, with the manual process. It's a manual process.
The Scottish Child Payment has been mentioned a couple of times. The reason for asking these questions is because I wanted to be asked some specific matters in relation to the child payment. Now the scale of it is huge. So for under sixes by Christmas next year, that's 170,000 children, 140,000 households, £70 million. When fully rolled out, it's 250,000 households. Now, I think, if my memory serves me right, the anticipated take-up rate is 84% in relation to that. So in terms of the planning, these are all good things, but in terms of the planning to deliver that, are you on target, would you say, to make sure that that is automated based on an 84% uptake? And what systems are you planning to put in place if, say, that's a 90% uptake?
So we are absolutely on target for delivery. There is a very, very tight window, as we've discussed previously, to deliver the Scottish Child Payment. That's why it is exceptionally important that it is based on the Best Start grant as absolutely as much as possible, because that allows us to use some of the systems and processes that are already in place. The more people want to change things, then the longer it would take to deliver, and the danger is it doesn't get delivered at all, or it puts behind other benefits. So there is an absolute requirement on ourselves, and I would suggest others, as they're looking at the Scottish Child Payment, to recognise the tight window that's there and to recognise the development window is very tight for that to happen. When we're looking at, as the point that David made, I think is very important, that the manual workarounds, or the manual processes, don't change because of the level of take-up. So the agency will get a go-live state, and that will be what will be used regardless of the take-up of it. It's the contingency that then springs into place to allow the agency to build up if the take-up is required. So the agency will know on day one what the processes will be, how many of them will require a manual process, and they will have been content that they will be able to deliver that benefit with the small amount of manual processes that are required because of the close working with the programme. Now, we had a meeting just yesterday afternoon, another discussion on what's being done to ensure that changes are being made to the entire suite of benefits to allow some of the manual processes to be taken out of the system before the Scottish Child Payment happens, to ensure that the agency is content that they will be able to deliver on the requirements that they have for the Scottish Child Payment. So I think the committee can be reassured that there is a great deal of work going on to ensure that the Scottish Child Payment is fit for purpose, and that the agency's processes on a much wider basis are also fit for purpose. When David mentions, for example, the redetermination and appeals, there are other cross-cutting aspects of the agency that needs to work regardless of what those benefits are. It's just that a decision is obviously taken about what scale the benefit is, and then we determine what is required at the go-live date for that benefit. So these will obviously build up over time. But I'm certainly content that the continuous improvement that the agency requires to allow it to be ready for go-live for Scottish Child Payment is absolutely integral to what the programme is delivering before the go-live date for Scottish Child Payment.
Do you want to add anything to that, Mr Wallace?
I guess just to re-emphasise the point the Cabinet Secretary has made, we're comfortable, we're planning for Scottish Child Payment. And we're doing that sort of modelling based on the Best Start grant, because both the systems and the processes will look broadly similar to that. The further that moves away from looking like Best Start grant, the more we'll need to sort of remodel as that goes through. So I guess it's just that absolute point. Our comfort comes from we know what this looks like. We know the skills, the processes that we need to bring into the organisation to deliver Scottish Child Payment. It's how that may change over time that would cause us to sort of remodel some of these things.
Okay, I welcome those reassurances, particularly that I think contingencies probably is a better word, because when we're using the expression workaround, it sounds as if the picture is a Social Security Scotland's going, oh my goodness, there's a much higher uptake, what do we do now? Here's the workaround. But if they're pre-planned contingencies, that provides reassurances. I would just ask that if anything changes, you update the committee so that we're aware of that. Now, if it's on this specific issue, Mr Balfour, because the Deputy Convener's come in for the next line of questioning, then absolutely, yeah.
Yep. I'm grateful. Thank you, Convener. I just want to follow up 2 quick points with Mr Wallace on that. Having worked on the tribunals, I just wonder what conversations are you having with the Tribunal Service as to what the information they want and in what form, because up until now, everything has been done by paper. It's particularly not good for the environment if you end up with lots of that. Have there been any conversations with the Tribunal Service to say, look, can we move to an IT system where we don't need to photocopy every page? And just, and that might also save your staff quite a lot of time.
So yes, those have been ongoing, and I think we're close to certainly having at least a system where we can send information electronically. The reference I was making earlier was what we have to do at our end, even just before then. So it's the pulling off of information from the system to prepare that pack effectively to go off to tribunals, and that's a manually heavy process at the moment, which again is absolutely fine for the volume that we're currently dealing with, but it's as we go into Scottish Child Payment that won't work. So yes, we're having those discussions, and I think we're close to that.
That's encouraging. I suppose everything just on the Best Grant, I think 40% of the cases that went to reconsideration got a positive response, or got a different award than that we had in the first place. Clearly, was that figure expected by you? It seems to be quite high for an award where you either have a baby or you're not having a baby. And could you just give us maybe a drill down a wee bit of why were these reconsiderations changed around? Was it to do with information that the claimant had provided initially, or was it just the number of volume of cases that you were dealing with?
So I think predominantly it has been around about, so you're right, that if there is a baby or not is a fairly clear point. The one that has changed, the majority of those decisions have been about in receipt of a qualifying benefit. So particularly that element about being in receipt of that benefit has changed. So some of these decisions have changed because people have come into receipt of qualifying benefit during that period, rather than necessarily it's been a fundamentally wrong decision. And payment, for example, in terms of UC, is in payment of UC rather than having made a claim for UC. One of the other big areas where doesn't necessarily change the redeterminations, but has been a big request, is people believing that child benefit should be a qualifying payment, which it clearly isn't. So it's these types of issues. But in terms of the changing, it's generally people either providing more evidence or coming into payment of a qualifying benefit.
So again, if I could just follow up briefly.
Briefly, but you're drifting off onto a different point. The Deputy Convener was coming in next, so
Okay.
very briefly.
Yeah, I'm interested in that issue that, so if I make a claim and my circumstances change, I don't have to do a fresh claim. So, I have a baby, I'm not on a qualifying benefit. 6 weeks later I am. I don't have to make a fresh claim. That claim stays alive?
It can do. So what we do in that process, and again, I think I would emphasise that we are trying to make the redetermination process as straightforward to deal with and as human to deal with as possible. So the team that deal with that would generally be in direct contact with somebody asking for a redetermination. And if it's clear that it is simply around about coming into it and they are now eligible, we would either we would do the claim in the background to make sure that happened, and it wasn't this claim gets rejected and you have to go right back into the start of the system. So those are the conversations that are happening to allow some of that to take place.
I'll stop there. Thank you.
Important line of questioning. I just wanted to make sure that we could move questioning on, but a good line of questioning. Deputy Convener.
Thank you very much. Good morning. So I wanted to ask for your guidance and any information in a clear way as you can. Help the committee. Going forward, it's quite a big task, obviously, setting up a new agency. It's the biggest thing the Parliament has done, and we've got to make sure that going forward that we're able to scrutinise each of the phases going forward and satisfy ourselves that the budget envelope that's been spent under DWP is the same envelope or similar envelope to the budget that we will end up with when we finally take over all the benefits. And of course, conscious that there's the transition of benefits, which we're doing in a phased manner. Then you've got the commitment to do things differently. So I don't know if there are added costs attached to that, for the way that you will, so redeterminations, for example, trying to get that right first time might require different skills. I don't know. And then, of course, there's the new commitments that the government have made to benefits that the DWP don't currently pay out. So what I've heard so far is you seem fairly satisfied going forward that in terms of accounting for the budget that's been effectively kind of drawn down through the agreements. But so from that, can the committee be satisfied that when we get to the end of the process that we'll have the appropriate budget in which to run the Scottish Social Security Agency?
I suppose you could kind of split this up into two areas. There's the administration of the social security system, which will allow agency colleagues to discuss. I think the key point for me is that having a humane system does not make it an expensive system. You can actually do things efficiently and effectively and that doesn't necessarily add to cost for how you administer it. And the most obvious one is the amount of time and cost that's required because of, for example, within PIP, the amount of cases that go to appeals. If you get the decision right first time, or obviously taking it back even further, if you don't need face-to-face assessments, you're entirely turning on your head the type of administration that we'll have. So there's an aspect about how we design the service that will have an impact on administration, but I would absolutely hold that doesn't necessarily make it an expensive system. It means it's a system that's fit for purpose. And also when it comes to the policies, will be different as well. And we have to be very cognizant as a government, as a parliament, that every small change that we make to a policy will add to the cost of providing that benefit and that payment, and that won't be met through the Scottish Block Grant. That will have to be met through it won't be met through the Block Grant adjustment. It will have to be met through the Scottish budget. So there are two areas really on this, both the administration and the policies, that it's very important that we get it right. And that we're very cognizant of the fact that as we take decisions or as stakeholders or the committee, etc., want and request the government to make further changes, they can have an impact on the budget, both up and down. I would say most of the requests usually put my budgets up rather than put them down. And that's just something we just need to be exceptionally aware of and live to as we go forward, that even what might seem a very, very small change can have significant consequences to the overall expenditure on a benefit payment. But I don't know if colleagues want to add a little bit more about the actual administration side of that.
Yeah, so in terms of the administration side, we are still comfortable within the figures of the outline business case. That, without it being a point, the 154 million administration costs in 2015 prices once fully operational. As the Cabinet Secretary says, decisions to be taken along the way will absolutely influence what that might look like, and those might be very, very small decisions, free phone, telephone numbers, how we communicate, etc. These will have a small impact on those, and there might be some larger ones. So again, the reference to how we prepare information for tribunals to make that easier will inevitably have a cost. But at this stage, in terms of the estimates, we feel comfortable that we're within the kind of outlined business case budget, which in itself is modelled effectively on an activity cost on what DWP are currently doing as well.
Thank you. Just two quick supplementaries on that. So in the case of the Best Start grant, I just wanted to understand, how that actually works. So, so you make your best estimate, as the convener pointed out, as to what you would spend, but then you noticed that there was going to be an additional uptake. So in scenarios like that, does that mean you go back to the DWP through the agreement and say, well, actually, you need to pay us more because the uptake is greater than we expected? Is that what happens?
If we increase benefit uptake, that's our responsibility to be able to meet those. So what we get from the Treasury is what it would have been like under steady state under the DWP. If we make changes in terms of policy, if we see dramatic increases in terms of benefit take-up, that is our responsibility within the Scottish Government budget to be able to make those changes and to be able to meet that budget. Now, of course, these are demand-led budgets, and if people are eligible for it, then they will absolutely be paid. But it really does bring into sharp focus as we move on, for later on in the year for budgetary analysis, the absolute importance of forecasting, not just what the agency is going to require in terms of administrating the service, but also in terms of how much it will cost to deliver all the payments. That forecasting is absolutely critical to allow us to be able to set the budget as close to what we believe is required as possible.
That increase in uptake on the Best Start grant was paid for by the Scottish Government budget, not the DWP, and that's easily identifiable in the budget. You can see that.
It will be for the budget this year. You'll be able to see that the amount that we spent on Best Start grant has went up substantially.
So it is contained within the annual report and accounts for the year up to March. And as you'll see within there as well, and James might want to say a little bit more, we will be able to balance that off within the budget that has been allocated for that particular year. And that will always be something that we try and do. James can say a bit more, but we work really closely, obviously, with Scottish Government finance colleagues about how that budget looks through the course of the year. And I think the important thing to recognise is this is a demand-led service that we are administering and will flow through our...
I'm sure there's a reason for it, and I just want to be clear in my own mind about this. So you didn't do anything in particular on the Best Start grant, you know, a policy change, and there was an increase in uptake just because it was just, well, who knows why there was an increase in uptake. Why shouldn't you be able to go back to the DWP? Is there something in the agreement preventing you from doing that? Say, well, we got the forecast wrong, so...
A substantial amount of work and marketing work in the run-up to December and also in the early start of the year. So there was an enormous amount done to encourage benefit take-up, both in terms of direct marketing, but also in terms of the work that was done with health professionals, etc.
Would be seen by the DWP then as you being proactive to encourage uptake, and because of that, that uptake which you didn't forecast, you pay for.
That's our responsibility.
Right, okay.
Now, we obviously did anticipate a forecast and forecasted an increase from DWP. Be fair to say, particularly in the first week, it was the demand for the service was higher than anticipated, particularly within that first week. But it is our responsibility, of course, quite rightly, to increase benefit take-up, but therefore it's our responsibility to pay for that too.
Okay, that's helpful. Clear. And just lastly, so there was some historic debt of 12 million in our notes. So that there would be an adjustment for that in that case. So just get the actual, yeah. So 12.996 million of historic, it was added to the Social Security accounts on the transfer of executive competence for carers allowance. So is that an adjustment in the budget?
It's essentially, I'll let James.
It's not an adjustment in the budget, so there's no budgetary cover that comes with that adjustment. You will see it in the Social Security Scotland accounts. So debt that existed for carers allowance at the date of executive competence transfer under the Scotland Act transfers to the Scottish Government. DWP gave us a capital grant in kind, which I won't bore the committee with the technicalities of that, but essentially it represents an asset movement between government bodies' accounts without any budget change in hand, so there is no budget comes with that transfer of debt.
I feel acknowledged that you'll not be able to answer. It just seems a bit strange that the Scottish Government would have signed up to such an agreement. It seems fair if there's historic debt, surely the DWP should pay. That just concerned me. I mean,
yeah, you could argue that. I mean, we take over executive competence of that benefit. That benefit at that point no longer lies with the DWP.
Historic debt. So surely it just seems a bit unfair. Or there's a different cut-off point where the debt is taken into consideration, so that the amount of the debt is transferred to the Scottish Government.
Yeah, hopefully James has been able to...
I know you're not responsible for negotiating the actual framework agreement, but it just seems that you've been landed in it a wee bit.
Yeah, but hopefully James is, and I don't know if you have some more detail into actually how there's no change of money budget.
I can. So this is not debt that the DWP owes. This is debt that recipients of carers allowance owe to DWP.
Right.
So because carers allowance has effectively been devolved, there is a question about what happens to clients who have had overpayments in the past and are making repayments of that debt that they now owe to the DWP at the point that devolution happens and they live in Scotland and are Scottish recipients of carers allowance. So the accounting adjustment that Audit Scotland refer to the £12.9 million of debt transfers by operation of the Scotland Act as a result of devolution. Nothing actually...
Back, is that what you mean?
DWP are currently getting it back. So the debt was owed to DWP as a result of an overpayment. DWP will continue to collect that debt as they always have. DWP have accounted for the budgetary benefit as a result of getting that debt back. It will lower their benefit expenditure in the year that the debt arose, so probably many years ago. And all it is consider it a tidy up of where the figures sit in and whose accounts. Actually on the ground, nothing is changing at all, and there's no disbenefit
To the budget?
No, not at all, not at all.
That's what it was. Thank you very much. That's helpful.
Okay, Shona Robertson.
Convener, I had initially was going to ask about the qualified opinion from Audit Scotland. Again, I feel we've maybe moved on from that.
Okay,
so,
do you want to come in just now and maybe come in a little bit later for yourself?
Well, I was going to ask about monitoring performance, so I think probably best come in with that. So, obviously, Audit Scotland made some recommendations about performance monitoring. They talked about customer feedback, client surveys. They need to further develop performance management and appropriate performance measures. So I was going to, if you could provide some additional information about, so for example, complaints, how are complaints learned from, what is the level of complaints? Presumably that will be relatively low given the starting point of where we are, but presumably that might be something that grows over time. So how are complaints learned from, and how is feedback from the public, both positive and negative, used in developing systems and informing the way that you're developing benefits themselves, but also the systems? So you could say a little bit about that, would be helpful.
So again, within our annual report and accounts, we've obviously published a level of complaints. I mean, I think the first thing to say about complaints is the ratios are phenomenally low, particularly for the year that we're looking at. So for carers, for Best Start grant, even in that kind of bulk of activity, there was only 30 complaints that came through around about that, and some of that was in relation to sort of that initial service level as well. But it's a tiny proportion of actually the volume that has gone through it. I think the most important part of that is how we're dealing with the feedback, I think, part of it. So we do go out to get feedback, whether that's complaints or whether that's positive feedback as well. One of the things I think I've said in front of the committee before is our ability, because of the devolution of social security, to be tight as how we work with the programme colleagues, how we get a really short line from our frontline client advisors who are getting that direct feedback from clients, and how we can actually do something about it. And again, the annual report and account sets out a couple of examples where we've been able to take that really raw feedback, whether it's on telephone or whether it's some other mechanism, and directly change, whether that's the wording in a letter, whether that's the wording on the website. So that loop has been significantly shortened for ours to react to the views of clients as well. And I think complaints, while I've no direct figures of it here as well, just in terms of difference of the system, what we've been really clear on as we set up our complaints process is that complaints do not get attached to a record of a client in the system, which was one of the concerns raised by clients as we developed this. And indeed, you do not actually have to be an active recipient of a benefit in order to make a complaint. So it's that wider, all that feedback is both welcome and then used by the organisation as well.
So just to be clear, the concern of recipients, if the complaint was tagged to their case, would be that somehow they might be concerned that that would reflect the relationship between they have with the agency. Is that?
There was a perception that if a client was marked as a complaint against a kind of a core system, then that in some way might reflect what would happen to them. So that has been removed. There's effectively a kind of Chinese wall within the organisation as the team that deal with complaints and team that deal with the benefits processing. So that's been taken, that risk has been removed for anyone feeling that would be held against them.
Okay. Just on a general point, I mean, I mentioned in relation to monitoring performance some of Audit Scotland's comments, and we touched at the beginning of this session about Audit Scotland's qualified opinion. What going forward is the follow-up, I guess, to Audit Scotland's comments across the board in terms of ensuring or trying to make progress so that when Audit Scotland report next, many of these issues will have been addressed, although I got the feeling from what the Cabinet Secretary said that the issue relating to the qualified opinion on regularity of carers allowance is something that has historic precedence from a UK perspective as well. I think you said going back to 1989. So there may be some issues that are going to be more difficult to change, and there may be themes that will continue to appear in Audit Scotland's reports going forward. I'm assuming that that might be one of them. But are you working with Audit Scotland to address some of the ongoing issues that were raised in their initial report?
So yes, absolutely. We're working with Audit Scotland on that as well, and also working with DWP on whether we can sort of improve that system as well. But I think you're right in that inference. I mean, as long as we're administering carers allowance through an agency agreement, there will be an underlying level of fraud and error in that system. And it is worth just also reflecting on the point Audit Scotland make that any social security system will have a level of fraud and error contained within it as well. So James might want to say a little bit more about the work that we're doing with DWP in particular and Audit Scotland to try and address some of those. But I think that is something that will not be a ready fix as long as we are administering that through an agency agreement. So I'll maybe just let James come on and say something else on there. I should also just, flipping slightly back to the point around about complaints and feedback, I should also mention, I think a number of members who have been in Dundee have seen it, we're also really keen to capture compliments that come into the organisation as well. So those are visibly available in Dundee, and we've replicated some of those in the annual report as well. But I'll let James come in on the other point.
Thank you. I'm probably keen to make sure the committee has a full understanding of what Audit Scotland mean by regularity, if you'll allow me. So regularity is whether our transactions are in accordance with relevant legislation, regulation and guidance. So Audit Scotland's opinion was that our accounts presented a true and fair view. They were in accordance with all international financial reporting standards, in accordance with the financial reporting manual, and that is the sort of core opinion that they've given on the accounts. What the auditor has done is he's been unable to reach an opinion as to the regularity only of carers allowance payments. So he's been unable to tell whether the carers allowance transactions are in keeping with relevant legislation, regulation and guidance, because he's had a limitation of scope essentially. He's not been able to get into DWP to track a case all the way back to a client to determine whether there's been an overpayment in that case. And that's as a result of, I think, the auditor not having the access that he would have hoped for. It's fair to say NAO the National Audit Office don't have that access at DWP either. We rely on DWP to produce statistics around overpayments, around levels of fraud and error. For carers allowance in particular, in terms of DWP's expenditure, it represents about 4%. It's a very small amount of their total expenditure, and they don't regularly measure the rates of overpayment, unfortunately. So the last time it was measured was around 20 years ago, although DWP are in the process of measuring it now, and they expect to complete that work by February 2020. So for next year, our auditor should be able to access rates for fraud and error. What that won't do, though, is lead to a clean opinion on regularity. The Auditor General in our Section 22 report that was laid alongside our accounts drew out that there's an inherent risk of fraud and error in benefit systems. I think, as the Cabinet Secretary said in her opening remarks, DWP have had qualified accounts as a result of regularity for the last 30 years. Because there's material levels of overpayment in the system, and it's very, very difficult to remove all fraud and error from the system. So it's very likely that had the auditor not had a limitation of scope, had they accessed all the information they would have wanted for carers allowance, given it's administered under an agency agreement in exactly the same way as in England and Wales, we would have had a full regularity qualification on the carers allowance expenditure for Scotland. And that is going to be a continuing issue under agency agreements, but it isn't the agency agreement itself that leads to that issue. Whether agency agreements are there or are not there, regularity of payments on benefit expenditure is an inherent risk in the system, and it is a risk we're well aware of as we go through our service design with our programme colleagues, but it is a difficult and inherent risk to address.
So the likelihood is we'll see another qualified opinion next year, unless things are moved on by you said February 2020 for the DWP being able to access or provide some of that information.
Yeah, so the DWP since I think April this year, the committee members will probably be aware that Westminster committees were interested in the payments of carers allowance, and I think on the back of that DWP are updating their fraud and error statistics around carers allowance. I think they've been doing it since I think April this year. It is not easy to produce these statistics. It takes a lot of analytical and investigative work to do. To prepare the statistics in a robust manner that auditors are going to be happy with. It will be interesting to see what those statistics say, and I think the audit opinion is a matter for the auditors, so I wouldn't like to speculate on what opinion he will reach.
Right, okay, thank you.
Okay, Mark Griffin.
Thanks, Convener. As more and more of the Social Security entitlements are devolved and Social Security Scotland takes on more responsibility for delivering those, and as general awareness of devolution increases, I would expect MSP's inboxes or surgeries or telephone calls from constituents to be more and more dominated by those with casework in relation to Social Security Scotland. And I just wanted to ask what the agency's arrangements are going to be for MSP's direct contact with the agency, with constituency casework.
So when we launched, I think I wrote to all MSPs with some details about how MSPs on a constituency basis could raise casework issues with the organisation. If it would be helpful, I'll recirculate, rewrite with some of those details. So there are arrangements in place to ensure that MSPs and constituency offices have those contacts. We've had some very limited contact through those arrangements, but I'm happy to sort of recirculate those so that they're up to date and everyone's aware of those.
Thanks, that would be helpful. And I just wanted to move on to how that scenario will then work with the DWP on the entitlements that will operate under agency arrangements. Cabinet Secretary will know that I think it's fair to say the committee have been fairly dissatisfied with how MSPs have been able to interact with the DWP to represent their constituents when it comes to reserved benefits. And while there are a range of entitlements become the responsibility of the Scottish Government and Scottish Parliament, but operating under agency arrangements, that I think it's fair to say that it wouldn't be acceptable if the same barriers were put up by the DWP for benefits which are the responsibility of this place. And just to give an idea of how the agency arrangements might inhibit or facilitate representation of our constituents.
If I could just expand on that slightly. So the team that would deal with direct MSP constituency inquiries will be able to probe with DWP if there's a read across to those that are administered under an agency agreement. So again, those that are the responsibility of the agency, we would expect to be able to do that. Those haven't particularly been tested yet and are kind of developing, but I would expect where we are responsible and there's an issue around about something that we are responsible for our team to take that and be able to do something with it. What we won't necessarily be able to do is to change, for example, if it's been correctly handled back to the agency agreement point, to make any change to that. but we should be able to step into DWP and understand a particular case. That doesn't necessarily mean if somebody's on a variety of benefits, as they're likely to be, that we can deal with the wholly reserved. But those that are devolved to the agency are devolved to the agency.
Yep, absolutely. We obviously wouldn't expect the agency to be able to change a decision that had been correctly made, but it's really helpful to know that even under agency agreements that the main point of contact for MSP casework is the agency. Can I just ask in terms of consent, whether MSP's offices will be able to contact the agency and have assumed consent for data sharing purposes, as MPs currently do with DWP hotlines?
Yes, and I think I did confirm that in the previous letter, but I'll absolutely make sure that's the case.
Thanks, Camilla.
Okay, can I just follow up on that a little bit? So, if I've got my dates right, executive competence for the range of disability benefits comes to the Scottish Government and in this place for April next year. Now, agency agreements will see those monies paid to DWP, and they'll continue to administer on that basis. So, like for example, I raised an example of a really poorly handled PIP case for my constituent, working age adult, in the chamber during the debate we had this week. If this was to happen after April 2020, the decision makers that I would have to speak to would be DWP decision makers, because whilst we are paying for the cost of the working age adults PIP, we're not administering it. Would the agency agreement between Social Security Scotland, the Scottish Government and DWP make sure that we can get that implicit consent, so that we can now go directly to DWP with these cases? Or was the suggestion to Mr Griffin that what we should do is go to Social Security Scotland for Social Security Scotland then to raise it with DWP? Because that seems to be one link in the chain too many and shouldn't really be required.
I probably prefer to kind of clarify that in writing to exact arrangements to try and handle those post-executive competence.
But you'll understand why
absolutely.
that would be. And then taking that a step further, so I expect you to provide the same answer, but sometimes when MSPs are contacting DWP, we're not just contacting them in relation to PIP, but in a range of other benefits, some of which will be devolved, but administered under agency agreements, some of them which are reserved. It would seem a real guddle or muddle and just crazy not to just then get that implicit consent across the whole range of benefits that and entitlements that exist. So perhaps that is something that both the Scottish Government and Social Security Scotland could raise with DWP and the UK Government as well. I think that would be a reasonable thing to do.
I absolutely appreciate that there is difficulty with MSPs and their direct correspondence with the DWP. That obviously is a matter for the DWP to make a decision on how they want to deal with MSPs, and I absolutely appreciate that frustration from personal experience onwards. It's absolutely frustrating. I mean, I think what we will absolutely guarantee is that we will do all we can within what we have responsibility for to make that as seamless and as easy as possible for MSPs. As David said, we haven't really required to have much discussions between MSPs through that hotline. I'd like to think that's because of the high level of service that people have been requiring, but obviously when we move to more complex benefits, people will have cases that they'll want to take up directly with the agency, and we will be absolutely determined to get our own house in order to make sure that MSPs are well serviced during that process. And if I can add, Convener, I didn't have time to specifically go back on the question and the point that you raised in your speech within disability assistance around that good practice that you're absolutely asking the government and the agency to look at, about how quickly you can make decisions if, in essence, we get the right information at the right time. And I'm certainly very keen to learn those lessons as well, and to make sure that we do that. So I was very interested in the case that you brought up, and indeed have had representation from the City of Glasgow Council on this as well, and very keen to make sure that we are doing all we can to learn from that good practice, even though it's slipped under the current circumstances with DWP.
That's really helpful. I'll pass on to Councillor Glasgow City Council your comments today. That's very helpful.
He will be doing so shortly.
Right, excellent. I'm sure he'll let me know that that's appreciated, and it would also be appreciated when those agency agreements that are being reviewed post executive competence, that there is a discussion between the Scottish Government and DWP in relation to implicit consent for MSPs when we're contacting them direct about something that the Scottish Government's picking up the tab for. I think that would be reasonable. We actually got a tweet from someone who was particularly interested in the idea of explicit and implicit consent and how it will extend to not just elected representatives with Social Security Scotland. And I'm just going to read it out now. Thanks, Anne. It would be really good to ask Social Security Scotland why they don't have the concept of implicit consent built into the Scottish Social Security system, so third sector advisors and welfare rights officers can assist their clients. Now, one of the things that I know that various MSPs have been seeking to establish in relation to issues with universal credit has certainly been that local authority welfare advisors or citizens advice bureaus don't have to jump through quite prohibitive hoops or barriers in terms of helping vulnerable constituents. And this individual clearly wants to make sure that we don't replicate some of those issues in relation to Social Security Scotland. So is that something that Social Security Scotland is giving consideration to, and can you maybe update us?
I'm certainly happy to look at. I suspect strongly, without falling back in the usual data protection sort of excuses, I think there'll be a clear how we verify somebody does represent someone. Clearly, when we were looking at MSPs, it made absolute logical sense that MSPs, we could verify. It was clear where offices are. It was clear what that community looks like. As we go wider into sort of third sector, there are literally hundreds, thousands of potential people who could be representing someone. But I think the point you made there, Convener, about making sure it's not a prohibitive check is the absolute element of that. As I understand it, we are doing some work around about that data sharing to make sure that it's an appropriate level of ensuring that we're speaking to somebody who's authorised to speak on behalf. So I would want to make clear it's not a prohibitive check, but I suspect we will want to have something in place which ensures that we're genuinely speaking about the personal information of somebody who is entitled to have that conversation with.
That's very helpful. It might be worth adding that, I mean, I don't think it was in the tweet, but when you talk about the network of local authority welfare support and advice, and you talk about the network of citizens advice bureaus, you're talking about large structured organisations who would be able to enter into protocols, I would think, with Social Security Scotland to get that kind of implicit consent, obviously with certain caveats in relation to data protection. So has there been any discussions with citizens advice or local authorities? And if not, then this might be a good opportunity to start to have those discussions.
I couldn't say right now whether those discussions are taking place about protocols yet, but I'm happy to take that one away. Where I think we do have really strong relationships is as we develop our local delivery partners as well. So we now have local delivery leads right across Scotland, and indeed have now recruited sort of layer down from that as we build up to having local delivery as a service for Wave 2 benefits. So, for example, I was at Bridgeton Citizens Advice Bureau last week, and as I walk into there, I do so with our local lead. It is absolutely clear that they have a really good, strong relationship with that Citizens Advice Bureau. So we need to put something in place to ensure that works at a client inquiry level. But in terms of an escalation as to how that works, we will have a structure locally across Scotland that allows third sector and other sectors to speak directly to the organisation around about issues which, whether they're case related or structurally related, are causing them problems.
Okay, now I'm going to ask Mark Griffin if he wants to come back. I think I'm conscious you led with this line of question. Is there anything you want to add before we move on?
No, thanks, Commissioner.
Okay. I don't have any other bids for questions, which is... Yeah, so it just means I need my eyes tested, and I apologise for that.
Patiently,
Oh,
convener,
right.
and listening.
Okay. Unlike the other committee members, Alison Johnson, MSP,
Not
will
at
take in a second. Alison.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just a couple of points. Social Security Scotland's annual report shows that there were 10 cases of overpayment due to agency error, totalling £4,000. And Audit Scotland had previously raised concerns that a comprehensive approach to minimising over and underpayment wasn't yet fully in place. I suppose I'd just like to ask what processes are in place to ensure that that error is minimised, especially where that leads to underpayment.
So I'd probably go back to the discussion we had around about manual processes. So even where those errors occurred, there should have been a manual quality process in place. What has occurred in those circumstances is essentially human error. And for the scale of the payments that we've made, that is a relatively small proportion of what we've done. There will always be inherently some of those errors in the system. So we do come back to that, have manual processes, quality around about individual processors, treatment of cases, and also some wider checks of the system. So those are functioning just now. Again, similar to the earlier conversation, the more of those that we can try to mechanise, the better. And those are some of the functionalities that, if we can put some system checks in place, starts to remove some of those potentials. But there will, in a case where one of our advisors has to make a decision on a case, there will always be the potential for it. But that's a level which, at the moment, I'm as comfortable as it can be, reflects relatively well on the whole number of cases that have been processed.
Yeah, I mean, I wholly appreciate here that a new agency is being built from scratch, and it's then being tasked with a huge responsibility to make that £3 billion system work. So I appreciate that does place huge demands on staff. And can I ask what processes are in place to monitor staff well-being?
In terms of a system, we are part of the Scottish Government. We've grown out in terms of the Scottish Government civil service sort of ethos in many ways. We have a strong relationship with our unions, for example. That's something that we meet regularly with around about all issues on the organisation, including sort of staff welfare. We have access to sort of welfare advisors. We have access to employee support programmes. These systems and processes are in place. I think where we see things which are specific to the organisation, we're also able to take some particular steps to do something very specific. So beyond the sort of remit of the annual report and accounts, for example, the recent funeral support payment, I think, was a really good example where we recognised that this is a benefit where we were making some new and additional demands on the staff within the organisation. So we went around about constructing that team in a very deliberate way of making sure people who were coming into that environment were ready for that. So we did it through volunteers. We then put them in through a really intensive period of understanding and training as to what that would look like, effectively dealing with very difficult, sometimes harrowing calls throughout the daily process. Through that, some people dropped out, so some people decided that this was not going to be the benefit for them to administer, and that was fine. We sort of redeployed them across the organisation. And even as that started to get flowing real live calls, we made sure that, again, people decided that might not be quite for them, so we were able to redeploy them. So the managers in that particular circumstance were really keenly aware that we were doing something that was very specific, which might have particular staff welfare issues. So there's a kind of the structure you would expect in place in terms of employee welfare. And again, over and above that, I think as particular benefits land, we're really conscious to look at does this strain the organisation in a particular way.
If I can just add to that, Convener, because I think it speaks very much to the ethos of the agency and what the agency is trying to deliver, and both myself and absolutely David as the Chief Executive are are absolutely adamant that fairness, dignity and respect is for the workforce, not just the clients, because you can't expect them to deliver it for the clients if you're not delivering it for every single person. And I'm really taken by how the agency is working very hard to ensure that that is embedded. You know, again, an obvious example about this is there's not targets to how long you'll stay on a phone for to a client. It will be as long as you're required. You don't need to get through a certain amount of calls or processes in a day. So if you've had a very difficult call, even without funeral support payment, the client advisors have the ability to take that step back, to speak to managers, to speak to others, to maybe take a bit of time to themselves. So it needs to be absolutely built in to the systems and processes and how we measure things, that actually someone taking a lot of time with a client is a good thing, and if that's what that client required, and to make sure that that ethos is absolutely as much there for the staff as it is for the people that they're there to serve.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you and good morning, and sorry for being late. I was dealing with an emergency. I hope this hasn't been asked, but just following up on that point, in terms of staffing, one of the things that was picked up by Audit Scotland was that the level of clear guidance for staff, and one of the bits was around ordinary residents as part of the requirements for whether you could receive benefits. And in the NHS and education and higher education, there's very clear guidance that's written about how to interpret that and how officials make the decision. Audit Scotland suggested that there wasn't that within Social Security Scotland, which obviously leaves that decision to the official, which could maybe cause some stress in decision. And I just wondered whether the intention is to write clear guidance on how to define what ordinarily resident in Scotland actually means.
Shall I take that one? So yeah, I mean, I think having worked in the higher education sector, I'm kind of quite familiar with the challenges around but ordinarily resident as well. I think from, like much of the conversation we've had just now, we believe we have robust processes in place for the nature of the benefits that we're dealing with. So it isn't that people were left to make decisions about residents, without guidance. They were making, effectively that decision was being made by the information provided by DWP on postcode. So it was really clear how residency was being determined. I think the point was around about as we grow into other benefits, that may become more complex. So absolutely, as that goes on, we will continue to sort of develop guidance around about it. And we are in touch, with example, for Student Awards Agency for Scotland about their approach to it, and NHS, which I think are examples that are mentioned in the Audit Scotland report of who are dealing with this as well. So again, I'll just come back to that. On all of this, the organisational capacity has been built deliberately, incrementally, as we go through the number of benefits. We don't feel that there is a thing at the moment which is a flaw in that system. It's simply that the check at the moment is essentially kind of automated from DWP, and I think the Audit Scotland report kind of reflects that actually that feels appropriate for what we're doing currently.
Thank you. What is your sense, I mean, as you go forward, and obviously once the disability benefits come on stream and are being delivered by Social Security Scotland, is your sense that there will be a change, that staff will need to up their game, I suppose? I'm trying to think of a way of phrasing it in terms of dealing with more complex. I mean, I think it's been good that they've started with benefits that are perhaps easier and more straightforward to deliver. But are the staff sort of talking about? Are you as a team looking at the kind of differences that will come along when you're having to make decisions about people rather than just more straight determinations, have you have a baby or haven't you, but more complex determinations about an individual's need and entitlement?
Can I perhaps come in on that, Convener? I am absolutely adamant that the staff at Social Security Scotland do not need to up their game. They are working effectively, very effectively, and I think the satisfaction rates that are being shown in what we are doing already absolutely demonstrates that. What we have said all along, what Audit Scotland have pointed to on numerous occasions, is of course that, as David said, as the benefits change, then the agency will change to deal with that. We absolutely know that the most complex benefits are still to come. That's why incrementally, as we move forward, the agency changes incrementally. So the guidance is appropriate for what is there at the moment. The guidance will be appropriate for what is required at Wave 2. And there needs to be an acceptance and an understanding of, as you build an agency incrementally, that's actually good practice. If we had people sitting about that we didn't actually require for Wave 1 benefits, but that we needed for Wave 2, that would be a poor use of money. So the recruitment is absolutely what's required for what the agency delivers at the moment. The guidance is appropriate for what the agency delivers at the moment. And the agency and the programme work well together to ensure that the staff are absolutely appropriately trained for the benefits that they are having to deliver.
Do you anticipate it will be the current staff that will go on to work on the Wave 2 benefits, or do you anticipate it being a new recruitment of staff for the Wave 2?
Well, given the fact that we're delivering more benefits, we'll of course have to recruit more staff. I think you pointed out during the course of the debate, we have recruitment advertisements out for the agency at the moment. That is because those are required for the next wave of benefits. So we will of course have new staff in post, and partly because it's an entirely different skill set that will be required, for example, case managers, the specialist advisors and so on. So there will be a different requirement rather than a client advisor that deals with a case for the Best Start grant or, for example, the Scottish Child Payment.
Okay, Jeremy Balfour.
Yeah, just two quick points. One maybe to the Cabinet Secretary, if that's okay. I noticed in the Audit Scotland report that, without embarrassing him, Mr Wallace has to reapply for his job, or he's got to go through a thing because of the restructuring of the senior management team. Was that always planned, or did that happen because, you know, having looked at it, you just think it's not quite working?
No, it is absolutely working effectively at the moment, and I'm not saying that just because David's sitting beside me, but it's been an absolute pleasure to work with David as the Chief Executive of the agency.
Restructured below him.
No, but I'd just like to make that clear as well. It's not because anything's going wrong at all. In essence, again, it goes back to the point about us building incrementally. The agency developed out of government. It was required to be smaller, perfectly swarmed, but smaller at that point. The requirement for the seniority of the senior management team requires to change as the agency. So this was part of the process that we'll have to go through. The senior management team is moving as the agency moves and develops as well. So it's absolutely can give reassurance. It's part of that incremental change rather than a decision within government.
And will that be reflected in budgetary decisions going forward? That will be put into budgets?
As we require to make changes to staff, all that will be absolutely within the annual accounts that will be published.
Okay. That's great. And I've just a final point, and perhaps maybe you could write to me, Mr Wallace, rather than getting into a long discussion. I would be a bit more interested just having reflected on your comment that, you know, when somebody makes an application, if the circumstances change with that application, that you can look at it and you can almost go back and backdate it. Just going forward, I'd be interested to know how you make those decisions. Is there a protocol that your team are working on? Because obviously that's different from what DWP do. And I'd be interested to know, is there consistency in how that is decided? Just that whole area, perhaps you can maybe just, write to the whole committee, I'm sure we'd like to know about it as well, but just a bit more information about how you actually work on that on a day-to-day practice, and is that something you see happening going forward with other benefits as well, that if your circumstances change, you can still look at that old application, if that makes sense?
Yeah. So I'm happy to write. I mean, on the very final point, and as the Cabinet Secretary says, what we're doing is we're building incremental capacity, but what we're doing now I do expect to replicate going forward. The whole ethos of the organisation is helping people get things that they're entitled to, not putting barriers in place for things that they're entitled to. So that ethos I would expect to go forward. But I'm happy to write with further detail. I
suppose what I'm just wanting to do without being legalistic is how does that fit into the regulations that the Parliament has passed? I suppose that's what I'm just trying to reflect on.
Okay, Okay, thank you, Mr Balfour. We're at the end of questions. I might want to mention to Mr Wallace that if you do have to reapply for your post, you might want to print out the official report from today's proceedings. I think the Cabinet Secretary put some quite helpful comments on the record this morning, and I'm sure Mr Balfour will be available for a reference as well, should you wish to take him up on that. Can I thank all four of our witnesses this morning for your evidence. That ends agenda item 2. I'm going to move to agenda item 3, which we've already agreed to take in private. So we're going to move into private session. Thanks, everyone.